Eline Goethals, thanks very much for talking to Ash Scotland here at the World Conference on Tobacco Control in Dublin. Could you tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing and the organisation that you're representing?
Yes, so I work for the School for Moral Ambition. I'm actually a fellow there, which is a fellowship where you're placed at an organization, and my organization is Institute for Global Tobacco Control. So I work with Dr. Johanna Cohen over there, and the work I've been doing has focused on tobacco endgame. More specifically, because I have a background in advertising, so more specifically on the narratives we have around tobacco endgame. So how can we change the way we talk about it to, in a way, accelerate the normalization of the concept and the elimination of the tobacco industry?
So in terms of that communication and promotion of that work, what would be your suggestions for Ash Scotland, other Ash organisations, and all the organisations that are here at the conference? What would be your key suggestions for us?
Yeah, so actually my work consists of 14 recommendations, but I will give you a couple of highlights. The work has started with a research towards the definitions we use, the narratives we use when it comes to tobacco endgame in general, and then also specific endgame policies, so how do we talk about them. And I've noticed that there's quite some confusion and maybe even division amongst tobacco endgame advocates of what the topic does mean, how we talk about it, and what the narratives are that we should use. Like, is it tobacco versus nicotine? How all-encompassing is it? Which policies are endgame policies, which aren't? And so my report, a couple of recommendations that try to bring some speed and some acceleration into that is, first of all, the definitional chaos is also hindering us from accelerating the endgame work itself. So in my opinion, and also based on some of the research I've looked at, is we should focus on how endgame systematically dismantles the power of the industry. So the elimination of industry should be way more present in the conversations we have. Also, because we know that tobacco industry denormalization is a well-proven technique which we should absolutely use more. So all eyes on the culprit. Yeah. Health stats and are important, but they're not the only thing. So instead of talking about a policy where we say that it protects youth, which is a good thing to say, we should also add how it, for example, eliminates a pipeline of new customers for the industry, because that's in the end what we try to do. Another recommendation is tobacco endgame is not one policy, but it's a menu of policies based on local contexts. We know that certain policies will get faster foot ground than others. So again, we should avoid the dismissal of the entire concept if policymakers, for example, come across one policy. Now let me think of another one that I can share. Oh yeah, maybe the fact that when talking about tobacco endgame, we should use words such as it's logical, it's realistic, yes. Yeah. It's the next step. Yes. It's not a replacement of FCTC or Empower, but it's more a complement to it. And when we see that countries that have gone through many of those steps, that they still need a next phase because we haven't eliminated tobacco or nicotine use. And so talking about tobacco endgame, it should never be a replacement, but just like a logical next step. And there's plenty of historical precedents of where we've done this before, and we can also use that as examples. Things we have banned in the past, either in full industries or specific products. This is not the first time that we're going to do that. So yeah.
Yes, it's an interesting concept because, of course, the big tobacco companies are ever present and so powerful and have many allies in different other businesses and representations. So, yeah, it's an interesting concept about making it normal that we're talking about the end of that industry when, a small advocacy organisation like Ash Scotland and others like us across the world, we are so outnumbered when it comes to the resources and capacity to try and influence. So yeah, it's a very interesting concept, but it makes sense absolutely because that is the end goal.
Yeah.
Could you talk about, when you said that there's other examples, could you give us some of the examples where there has been an end game and industries have disappeared on the back of it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, lead in paint is one a good example. In Europe, asbestos was also very present in many of the materials we use in construction. In my report, I even use the example of slavery, which is, of course, a long time ago. But if you look at how slavery was ended, it was not just a moral decision to end slavery. It was actually also a very well thought out plan where some I think British trailblazers were the first to see that abolishing slavery is not done on moral ground, but a smart strategic process where they focused on slave trade specifically. And so on specific slave trade policies within the UK. And they were actually quite smart. It was the school I work at is actually based on a book that shares a story of how slavery was abolished. And so how they went on with the process of like, can we change tiny policies to make sure that in the end we strategically do end up with a complete abolition of the whole concept. I think it's very clever and something we can all learn of how to get there without going from 1 to 0 on one day, because that's never going to happen even with tobacco.
Absolutely, that's a great example, and particularly for those of us from Scotland, because Glasgow, the biggest city in Scotland, back 150 years ago and more, the wealth that was created, not for the population at large, but from the merchants that were using slavery back in the day to make profit from tobacco. So yeah, that's a great example. Thanks for that. Has there been anything from other delegates at the conference that you're taking away as like learnings from the last 2 or 3 days?
Yeah. Well, many things. I presented my report very briefly as well, and I did not necessarily know the other people who were going to present, but I was super glad to see that the other studies that were being presented were all public support studies on either endgame as a concept or specific endgame policies. And all of them, super recent data, all of them prove the point that for when it comes to tobacco endgame, that the public is actually ahead of politicians, whilst I think tobacco might be a topic where some politicians are afraid of touching because they might lose constituents. We actually see most of the research always showing high public support, both for specific policies and just the general concept of we should not allow corporate greed to addicts to make addicts out of our children. So I was very happy to see those results.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the inspiring governments to take the actions that we need to eliminate tobacco and reduce their influence in society, do you have any suggestions for the likes of Ash Scotland and other advocacy organisations, and what challenges should we be setting the governments across the world?
Yeah, so we've seen many governments set very ambitious endgame goals, certain decrease in prevalence, often below 5% by a certain date. But what we've seen is that often the plan on how to then get there is lacking. The goal is set, but we don't necessarily know how to get there. And that's the beauty, I think, of the fact that the goal has been set. I recommend for advocates to really champion that date. Make it a day like the Tobacco Liberation Day, and use it as a conversation starter with the politicians you work with, and help them, hold them accountable of what's the plan to get there, and what are we doing right now. And also, are we getting there? Are we on track? Like we have the projections of how do we get to 2040, for example, and just use it to hold them accountable and as a conversation starter.
Yeah, absolutely, because Scotland was one of the first countries to set an endgame target, but currently as things stand, we're not on track to have smoking rates of 5% or less across every community. We might manage it at population level, but not at community. So yes, we definitely agree with you. We need to be challenging both the Scottish Government and the UK Government to
Hold
take
them
that.
accountable.
Hold them accountable, put their feet to the fire.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you'd like to say to us or anyone else that's working in tobacco control that you haven't said already?
Mm, well, to me, and again, like I'm a bit of an outsider since I'm fairly new to tobacco control. I think we should never underestimate the power of exposing the industry, making the industry more visible, and not doing it in a generic way of just as I now was doing, talking generically about the industry, but make it very concrete for your country, for your jurisdiction. What are they doing? Who are they meeting with? It's a bunch of work to figure it out, but we do know that the narrative, which I always call the narrative of resisting corporate greed, I mean, 2025, we're getting a beautiful display of what happens when we listen to corporate greed and when we follow along. We're at a crossroads where bringing that narrative against just go for the health of people, resist corporate greed, definitely seems to be getting a lot of traction. So I would make it way more prominent, even in campaigns towards public or youth who are, as we've seen, also not aware of the lengths the industry goes to. They know that there's an industry making money of their products, but they don't know how they're being manipulated. They don't know how they use litigation. They don't know how they lobby our politicians. They don't know how big the tobacco industry is. I always use the analogy of the fact that big tobacco is bigger than Meta, Google, and Apple combined, which we all think are enormous companies, but we don't know how much money is going on there. And just making that more visible and using it in conversations, I feel like could give us some fresh winds for some of the conversations we'd be having.
And what would you say directly to young people in Scotland, across the UK, across Europe, across the world? What would you say to inspire them to take those actions?
Well, don't become, in Dutch, the word for addiction is enslaved. If we would translate addiction to Dutch, it would be enslaved. And I would say don't be enslaved to a corporation that is built to just attract all the money you have, get you dependent on the actions that they take, and they will do so for the rest of your life, and you'll get even super sick and die from it when you're way older. But the fact that they're already being enslaved today, as from their very first puffs, it could also get them on board of resisting again that corporate greed, that industry.
That's a perfect line to end on. Thanks very much for your perspective, Lena. Much appreciated.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.